The dust swirled around Eleanor's worn boots as she stepped off the stagecoach, her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Tombstone, Arizona stretched before her, in all its lawless glory, a town where dreams came to die and fortunes were made with the pull of a trigger. She clutched her carpet bag tighter, the weight of her father's debts pressing down on her shoulders like the unforgiving desert sun. 3 months. That's all she had to find work, earn enough money, and save the family ranch back in Missouri before the bank seized everything her family had built over 3 generations. The saloon doors swung open with a violent crash, and out stepped a man who seemed to command the very air around him. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that caught the afternoon light and eyes the color of storm clouds, he moved with the fluid grace of a predator. A silver star gleamed on his chest, and twin Colts hung low on his hips. Sheriff Jake Morrison had a reputation that preceded him like thunder before lightning. Fair, but ruthless, protective of the innocent, and absolutely devastating to those who crossed him. When his gaze found Eleanor standing alone by the stagecoach, something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition that made her breath catch in her throat. "Hey there, friend. Before we continue with Eleanor and Jake's story, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel if you're enjoying this tale of romance and danger in the Old West. And tell me, what city are you watching from? I love connecting with listeners from all over the world." Their eyes met across the dusty street, and Eleanor felt the world tilt on its axis. She'd heard stories about Sheriff Morrison, how he'd cleaned up 3 towns before Tombstone, how his mere presence could stop a gunfight before it started, how women from miles around would travel just to catch a glimpse of him. But nothing had prepared her for the intensity of his stare, the way it seemed to see straight through to her soul. He approached with measured steps, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden planks of the boardwalk. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat with a gesture so smooth it seemed choreographed. His voice was deep, rich like aged whiskey, with just a hint of a southern drawl that made her knees feel weak. "You look like you might be lost. This isn't exactly the safest place for a lady to be standing alone." Eleanor straightened her spine, drawing on every ounce of dignity she possessed. She might be desperate, but she wasn't helpless. "I'm not lost, Sheriff. I'm exactly where I need to be. I'm looking for work." Something dangerous flickered in his eyes, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What kind of work would that be, miss?" "Eleanor Whitmore," she replied, lifting her chin defiantly. "An honest work, if you must know. I can cook, clean, keep books, teach children. I'm not afraid of hard work." Jake studied her for a long moment, taking in her travel-worn dress that had once been fine, the determined set of her shoulders, the way she met his gaze without flinching. Most women in Tombstone either cowered from him or threw themselves at him with obvious intentions. Eleanor Whitmore did neither, and that intrigued him more than he cared to admit. "The schoolhouse needs a teacher," he said finally, "but it's dangerous work. We've had 3 teachers leave in the past 6 months. Parents don't always appreciate education, and some of the older boys can be challenging." Eleanor's heart leaped with hope, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. "I'm not easily intimidated, Sheriff Morrison." A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his stern features into something that made her pulse race. "I believe you, Miss Whitmore, but Tombstone has a way of testing even the strongest souls." The next morning, Eleanor stood before a classroom filled with 23 children, ranging in age from 6 to 16. The older boys slouched in the back, their eyes filled with the kind of defiance that came from growing up too fast in a town where violence was as common as sunrise. The younger children watched her with curious eyes, their faces scrubbed clean by mothers who still believed in the power of education to lift their families from the dust and desperation of frontier life. Eleanor smoothed her skirt and picked up a piece of chalk, her hand trembling slightly as she wrote her name on the blackboard. "Good morning, children," she began, her voice stronger than she felt. "My name is Miss Whitmore, and I'm here to learn as much from you as I hope to teach." A snicker came from the back row where Tommy Garrett, the blacksmith's son, sat with his arms crossed and a smirk on his face. At 16, he was nearly as tall as a man and twice as stubborn as a mule. "What could you possibly learn from us, lady? How to shoot? How to survive when the Apache come calling? How to tell when a man's lying through his teeth?" Eleanor turned to face him, her green eyes flashing with determination. "I could learn about courage, Tommy. About what it means to grow up in a place where every day is a choice between hope and despair. About the strength it takes to believe in something better when everything around you suggests otherwise." The classroom fell silent, and even Tommy seemed taken aback by her response. Eleanor seized the moment, moving closer to the students, her voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "I know what it's like to lose everything, to watch your family's dreams crumble like sand through your fingers, to feel like the whole world is against you and there's nowhere left to turn." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But I also know that education is the one thing no one can take away from you. It's a weapon more powerful than any gun, a tool that can build bridges where others see only walls." By the end of that first day, Eleanor had managed to capture the attention of even the most reluctant students. But as she walked home through the dusty streets of Tombstone, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Sheriff Morrison stepped out of the shadows near the general store, his presence both comforting and unsettling. "How was your first day, Miss Whitmore?" he asked, falling into step beside her. The setting sun cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the intensity of his gaze. "Challenging," Eleanor admitted, acutely aware of how close he was walking, how his arm occasionally brushed against hers. "But promising. The children are brighter than anyone gives them credit for." Jake nodded, his expression thoughtful. Children in Tombstone have to be smart to survive. But intelligence and education aren't always the same thing. They walked in comfortable silence for a few moments. The only sounds, the distant piano music from the saloons and the soft whisper of Eleanor's skirts against her legs. "Miss Whitmore," Jake said suddenly, stopping in front of the boarding house where she was staying. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Eleanor's heart began to race, wondering if somehow he'd discovered the truth about her father's debts, about the real reason she'd come to Tombstone. "Of course, Sheriff." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the leather and gunpowder scent that seemed to cling to him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes. "Are you running from something or someone?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a gunshot. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush, torn between the desire to tell him everything and the need to protect herself. "We're all running from something, aren't we, Sheriff? The question is whether we're running towards something better or just running away." Jake's eyes searched her face, looking for deception, for the telltale signs that had helped him survive in a profession where trust was a luxury few could afford. But all he saw was honesty, vulnerability, and a strength that seemed to shine from within her like candlelight in a dark room. "That's not an answer, Miss Whitmore." Eleanor took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to reveal. "My father owes money to some very dangerous men back in Missouri, men who don't believe in second chances or payment plans. I have 3 months to earn enough to pay his debts, or they'll take our ranch. Everything my family has worked for will be gone." The admission seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with implications and unspoken fears. Jake's expression darkened, and his hand instinctively moved toward his gun. "How much money are we talking about?" $500, Eleanor whispered, the amount sounding impossibly large when spoken aloud. "I know it seems like a fortune, but the teaching position pays well, and if I'm careful with my expenses—" $500, Jake repeated, his voice grim. "Miss Whitmore, do you have any idea what kind of men would loan that amount of money to a rancher? What they're capable of?" Eleanor's chin lifted defiantly. "I know exactly what kind of men they are, Sheriff. That's why I'm here instead of there. That's why I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn that money honestly." Something in her tone, in the fierce determination that blazed in her green eyes, made Jake's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that felt both natural and charged with unspoken tension. Eleanor threw herself into her teaching with a passion that amazed even the most skeptical parents. She organized spelling bees that drew crowds from across town, started a small library with books donated by traveling merchants, and somehow managed to convince even Tommy Garrett that learning to read and write might actually be useful skills. But it was her interactions with Sheriff Morrison that set her heart racing and her thoughts spinning in directions she'd never allowed them to go before. He made a habit of walking her home each evening, claiming it was for her safety, but Eleanor suspected there was more to it than that. Their conversations ranged from the practical, which families were struggling, which children needed extra attention, to the deeply personal. She learned that Jake had grown up on a farm in Texas, that he'd lost his parents to cholera when he was 17, that he'd worn a badge for 8 years and had never once regretted the choice. He learned that Eleanor had been engaged once to a banker's son back in Missouri, but had broken it off when she realized she was more in love with the security he represented than with the man himself. "Do you ever regret it?" Jake asked one evening as they stood outside the boarding house, the desert air cooling around them like a gentle caress. "Breaking your engagement?" Eleanor considered the question, watching the way the lamplight played across his features. "I regret the pain I caused him. He was a good man, just not the right man, not for me." "What would be the right man for you, Miss Whitmore?" The question was asked quietly, almost casually, but Eleanor could hear the underlying intensity in his voice. She turned to face him fully, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Someone who sees me as I really am, not as what he wants me to be. Someone who challenges me to be better while accepting me as I am. Someone who, well..." She trailed off, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, how his eyes seemed to be drinking in every word she spoke. "Someone who what?" Jake prompted, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush, but she didn't look away. "Someone who makes me feel like I'm worth fighting for." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning and possibility. Jake reached up slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek, and Eleanor felt herself leaning into his touch, despite every rational thought in her head telling her to step back. "Eleanor," he said, her name sounding like a prayer on his lips. "You are worth fighting for. Any man who can't see that is a fool." The moments stretched between them, electric and full of promise, until the sound of gunshots from the direction of the saloon shattered the spell. Jake's hand dropped from her face, and his entire demeanor shifted from tender to deadly in the space of a heartbeat. "Get inside," he commanded, his voice sharp with authority. "Lock your door and don't come out until morning." Eleanor wanted to protest, to ask him to be careful, to tell him that the thought of something happening to him made her feel sick with fear. But he was already moving, his long strides carrying him toward the sound of trouble, with the fluid grace of a man who had faced danger countless times before. From her window, Eleanor watched as Jake disappeared into the chaos of the saloon district, and she realized, with startling clarity, that somewhere in the past few weeks, she had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with the sheriff of Tombstone. The thought should have terrified her. She was here to earn money and save her family's ranch, not to complicate her life with romantic entanglements. But as she pressed her hand against the glass and whispered a prayer for his safety, Eleanor knew that her heart had made its choice, regardless of what her mind might think was practical. The next morning brought news that chilled Eleanor to the bone. The gunfight at the saloon had been more than just a typical Saturday night brawl. It had been a message. 3 strangers had ridden into town, asking questions about a schoolteacher named Eleanor Whitmore. When the bartender claimed he'd never heard the name, they'd started shooting. Jake had arrived in time to drive them off, but not before they'd made their intentions clear. They knew where Eleanor was, and they were coming for her. "Pack your things," Jake said without preamble when he appeared at the schoolhouse door that morning. His face was grim, his eyes hard as flint. "I'm putting you on the next stage out of town." Eleanor looked up from the lesson she was preparing, her heart sinking at the finality in his tone. "I'm not leaving." "This isn't a request, Eleanor. Those men last night, they're not here for a friendly conversation. They're here to collect a debt, and they don't much care whether you're breathing when they take you back to Missouri." Eleanor set down her chalk and turned to face him fully, her chin lifted in the stubborn gesture he'd come to know so well. "I said I'm not leaving. I have a job to do here, children who are counting on me, and I won't run away just because some thugs want to intimidate me." Jake crossed the room in 3 quick strides, his hands gripping her shoulders with barely controlled intensity. "Don't you understand? This isn't about intimidation. These men will kill you if they have to. They'll burn down this whole town to get to you, if that's what it takes." Eleanor could see the fear in his eyes, the desperation that he was trying so hard to hide behind his authoritative facade. "Then help me fight them," she said quietly. "Don't send me away. Help me find a way to end this that doesn't involve running for the rest of my life." For a moment, Jake's grip tightened, and Eleanor thought he might actually shake her. Then his hands gentled, sliding down her arms to capture her hands in his. "Eleanor, if something happened to you," he stopped, unable to finish the sentence, but the raw emotion in his voice said everything he couldn't put into words. "Nothing is going to happen to me," Eleanor said firmly, stepping closer until there was barely an inch of space between them. "Not if we're smart about this. Not if we work together." Jake stared down at her. This woman who had somehow managed to turn his carefully ordered world upside down in the space of a few weeks. She was asking him to trust her, to believe that together they could face down men who made their living through violence and intimidation. It went against every instinct he had as a lawman, every protective urge that had kept him alive for 8 years. But as he looked into her green eyes, blazing with determination and courage, Jake realized he would follow her into hell itself if she asked him to. "What do you have in mind?" he asked finally, his voice rough with emotion. Eleanor smiled, the expression transforming her face and making his heart skip a beat. "We give them exactly what they want. We make them think they've won. And then we turn the tables on them." Jake raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "Go on." Eleanor took a deep breath, her mind racing with possibilities. "They want me to come back to Missouri to face my father's creditors. Fine, let them think I'm willing to do that. Let them think they've broken me, that I'm ready to give up and go home. But what they don't know is that I'll have the best sheriff in the territory watching my back." The plan they hatched was dangerous, requiring split-second timing and nerves of steel. Eleanor would appear to surrender, agreeing to return to Missouri with the men who had come for her. But Jake would be waiting, along with a carefully chosen group of deputies, to intercept them before they could leave Arizona territory. It was risky. If anything went wrong, Eleanor could end up dead or worse. But it was also their best chance to end the threat permanently and give Eleanor the freedom to choose her own future. The confrontation came 3 days later, just as the sun was setting behind the mountains that surrounded Tombstone. The 3 men rode into town like harbingers of doom, their faces hard and their intentions clear. Eleanor waited for them in front of the schoolhouse, her hands steady, despite the fear that coursed through her veins like ice water. She had changed into her traveling dress, packed her carpet bag, and arranged her face into an expression of defeated resignation that she hoped was convincing. "Miss Whitmore," the leader of the group said as he dismounted, his voice carrying the flat, emotionless tone of a man who had done terrible things and felt no remorse. "I'm Silas Crane. I believe you know why we're here." Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "My father's debt. I understand you've come to collect." Crane smiled, the expression cold and predatory. "Smart girl. Your daddy should have raised you to be more careful about the company he keeps. But don't you worry. We'll make sure you get home safe and sound. Assuming you cooperate, of course." Eleanor forced herself to nod again, playing the part of the frightened, defeated woman they expected to see. "I'll come with you. I need to say goodbye to someone first." Crane's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "The sheriff? I don't think that's such a good idea, Miss Whitmore. Might give him ideas about playing hero." "Please," Eleanor said, allowing real desperation to creep into her voice. "Just 5 minutes. I promise I won't cause any trouble." Crane considered this for a moment, then shrugged. 5 minutes. But if you try anything clever, it won't go well for you or your sheriff friend." Eleanor walked slowly toward the jail, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear her own footsteps. This was the most dangerous part of the plan. If Crane or his men suspected anything, if they noticed the subtle positioning of Jake's deputies around the town square, if they realized that what looked like a surrender was actually a carefully orchestrated trap, everything would fall apart in a hail of gunfire. She pushed open the door to the sheriff's office, and Jake looked up from his desk, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Eleanor," he said, rising to his feet, "I heard they were here." She nodded, acutely aware that Crane was probably watching through the window. I have to go with them, Jake. It's the only way. Jake moved around the desk, his movements deliberate and measured. I won't let them take you. You have to, Eleanor whispered, stepping closer to him. Trust me. Trust the plan. Jake's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones with infinite tenderness. If anything happens to you, it won't, Eleanor said firmly. But Jake, if something does go wrong, I need you to know. She paused, gathering her courage. I need you to know that these past few weeks have been the happiest of my life. That falling in love with you was the best thing that ever happened to me, even if the timing is terrible. Jake's eyes widened at her confession, and for a moment, the careful control he maintained slipped entirely. Eleanor, don't look away, she commanded softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to see your eyes when I tell you this. Jake's gaze locked with hers, intense and unwavering. I love you too, he said, the words rough with emotion. More than I ever thought possible, more than is probably smart for a man in my position. Eleanor felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back. Then make sure this plan works, Sheriff Morrison, because I have every intention of coming back to you. The kiss that followed was desperate and tender, full of promises and fears and hopes for a future that seemed impossibly fragile. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Eleanor could see her own emotions reflected in Jake's storm-gray eyes. Time's up, Crane's voice called from outside, sharp with impatience. Eleanor straightened her shoulders, drawing on every ounce of strength she possessed. I have to go. Jake nodded, his jaw tight with the effort of letting her walk into danger. I'll be right behind you, I promise. Eleanor smiled, the expression brave and beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. I know you will. You're the best sheriff in the territory, remember? The ride out of Tombstone felt like the longest journey of Eleanor's life. Crane and his men flanked her horse, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. They had been riding for nearly an hour when Crane finally began to relax, apparently convinced that Sheriff Morrison had decided not to follow. Eleanor kept her expression carefully neutral, but inside, her heart was racing with anticipation. According to the plan, Jake and his deputies should be moving into position right about now, using their superior knowledge of the terrain to get ahead of Crane's group and set up an ambush at Devil's Canyon, a narrow pass that was the only route through the mountains. You're awfully quiet, Miss Whitmore, Crane observed, his voice carrying a note of suspicion. Not having second thoughts, are you? Eleanor forced herself to look at him, schooling her features into an expression of resigned defeat. What would be the point? You've made it clear what will happen if I don't cooperate. Crane laughed, the sound harsh and unpleasant. Smart girl, your daddy could learn a thing or two from you about accepting reality. Eleanor bit back the angry retort that sprang to her lips, reminding herself that she needed to keep playing the part of the defeated victim for just a little while longer. As they approached Devil's Canyon, Eleanor could feel the tension in the air, like electricity before a storm. The narrow walls of the canyon rose on either side of them, creating perfect cover for an ambush. Eleanor's hands tightened on her reins, and she found herself holding her breath as they entered the shadowy passage between the towering rock formations. For a moment, nothing happened, and Eleanor began to fear that something had gone wrong with the plan. Then Jake's voice rang out from somewhere above them, clear and commanding, and absolutely deadly. "This is Sheriff Morrison. You're surrounded. Throw down your weapons and surrender, and nobody has to get hurt." Crane's reaction was instantaneous and violent. He spurred his horse forward, reaching for Eleanor's reins, while simultaneously drawing his gun. "Like hell!" he shouted. "You want the girl, Sheriff? Come and take her." The canyon erupted in gunfire as Jake's deputies opened fire from their concealed positions among the rocks. Eleanor threw herself from her horse, rolling behind a boulder as bullets whined overhead. She could hear Crane cursing, could hear the sound of horses screaming and men shouting, but she kept her head down and prayed that Jake's plan would work. The gunfight seemed to last forever, but in reality, it was over in less than 5 minutes. When the smoke cleared and the echoes of gunshots faded away, 2 of Crane's men were dead, and Crane himself was wounded and disarmed, sitting against a rock wall with blood seeping through his shirt. Jake appeared at Eleanor's side as if by magic, his hands running over her frantically, checking for injuries. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough with fear and adrenaline. "Did they hurt you?" Eleanor shook her head, suddenly feeling weak with relief. "I'm fine." Eleanor pulled back just enough to look up at him, her hands framing his face the way he had done to her in the sheriff's office. "You didn't lose me. You saved me. We saved each other." Jake's eyes searched her face, looking for any sign of trauma or fear, but all he saw was love and relief and a strength that continued to amaze him. "Eleanor, I know," she said softly. "I know." The kiss that followed was different from the desperate embrace they had shared in the jail. This one was full of relief and joy, and the promise of a future that suddenly seemed bright with possibility. 6 months later, Eleanor stood in front of the mirror in her room at the boarding house, adjusting the simple white dress she had chosen for her wedding day. The threat from Missouri was gone. Crane had agreed to testify against Eleanor's father's creditors in exchange for a reduced sentence, and the corrupt officials who had been protecting the loan sharks were now facing federal charges. Eleanor's father had written to tell her that the ranch was safe, that the family's debts had been forgiven, and that she was welcome to come home anytime she wanted. But Tombstone had become home in a way that Missouri never had. The children at the school had flourished under her guidance, several of them already talking about attending college back east. The town had grown and prospered, attracting new families who valued education and civilization over the lawless frontier mentality that had once dominated the area. And most importantly, Tombstone was where Jake was, where their life together was just beginning. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and Eleanor turned to see Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house owner, peeking in with a smile. "Are you ready, dear? The sheriff is waiting at the church, and he looks like he might pace a hole in the floor if you don't get there soon." Eleanor laughed, the sound bright and joyful. "I'm ready." As she walked through the streets of Tombstone toward the little church where Jake was waiting, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had come to this dusty frontier town as a desperate woman running from her family's problems, and she was leaving the boarding house as a bride, ready to start a new chapter of her life with the man she loved. The church was packed with townspeople, students, and fellow teachers who had become like family to Eleanor over the past months. But she only had eyes for Jake, who stood at the altar in his best suit, his badge gleaming on his chest, and his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart race. As she walked down the aisle, Eleanor remembered the first time she had seen him, how he had commanded her attention with nothing more than his presence. Now, as she placed her hand in his and looked into his storm-gray eyes, she knew that she would never look away again. "Dearly beloved," the preacher began, but Eleanor barely heard the words. She was lost in Jake's gaze, in the promise she saw there, in the future that stretched out before them like an endless horizon. When it came time for their vows, Jake's voice was steady and sure as he promised to love her, protect her, and stand by her side through whatever challenges life might bring. Eleanor's voice was equally strong as she promised to be his partner, his equal, his companion in all things. "You may kiss the bride," the preacher announced, and Jake needed no further encouragement. He pulled Eleanor into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was tender and passionate and full of promise. The congregation erupted in cheers and applause, but Eleanor heard none of it. All she could focus on was the man holding her, the love shining in his eyes, and the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. As they walked back down the aisle together, hand in hand, Eleanor caught sight of Tommy Garrett in the crowd. The boy who had once been her most challenging student was now one of her greatest success stories, having earned a scholarship to attend college in California. He grinned at her and tipped his hat, and Eleanor felt a surge of pride and satisfaction that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the difference she had made in this rough frontier town. Later, at the reception in the town hall, Jake pulled Eleanor aside for a private moment. They stood on the porch, looking out over the town that had brought them together, the desert stretching endlessly beyond the buildings and streets. "Any regrets, Mrs. Morrison?" Jake asked, his arm around her waist, his voice warm with contentment. Eleanor leaned into his embrace, feeling more at peace than she ever had in her life. "Only one," she said, and Jake's eyebrows rose in surprise. "I regret that it took a family crisis to bring me here. I regret all the time we might have had together if I'd been brave enough to leave Missouri sooner." Jake chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Well, Mrs. Morrison, we have the rest of our lives to make up for lost time." Eleanor turned in his arms, her hands resting on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. "The rest of our lives," she repeated, the words tasting like honey on her tongue. "I like the sound of that, Sheriff Morrison." The challenges that had brought them together were behind them, but Eleanor knew that new adventures awaited. There would be more students to teach, more problems to solve, more moments of danger and triumph and quiet joy. But whatever came, they would face it together. Two strong souls who had found in each other the perfect complement to their own strengths and weaknesses. The desert wind whispered around them, carrying the scent of sage and possibility. And Eleanor smiled as she realized that she had finally found what she had been searching for all her life without even knowing it. Not just love, though Jake's love was a gift beyond measure. Not just security, though she felt safer in his arms than she ever had elsewhere. What she had found was home. Not a place, but a person. Someone who saw her exactly as she was and loved her not in spite of her flaws, but because of them. Someone who challenged her to be better while accepting her completely. Someone who made her feel like she was worth fighting for. As they walked back into the reception, ready to celebrate with their friends and neighbors, Eleanor caught Jake's hand and squeezed it gently. He looked down at her, his eyes questioning, and she smiled. "I love you, Sheriff Morrison," she said simply. "I love you too, Mrs. Morrison," he replied, his voice soft with wonder, as if he still couldn't quite believe that she was his. "Forever and always. Forever and always, Eleanor agreed, and as they rejoined their wedding celebration, she knew that no matter what the future might bring, they would face it together. Two hearts beating as one under the vast Arizona sky.